Two doormen stood guard outside Prince Chen's mansion. One of them, Doorman A, let out a yawn, only to be startled by the sudden appearance of a chicken leg. Confusion gripped him as he wondered how a chicken leg could appear out of nowhere. It was as though the invisibility cloak had been lifted, revealing a creature with the features of both cats and mice. But this creature was too plump to be a cat, leaving the two guards bewildered. As they puzzled over the strange animal, it began to paw at its face incessantly, revealing its true form, a beautiful fox. Realization dawned on the guards that this was no ordinary cat, and they knew they had to act swiftly to avoid the wrath of Prince Chen. With determination, they armed themselves with a stick and a rope and lunged at the fox. But the fox was quick and agile, dodging their attacks with ease. Confusion clouded her mind as she wondered why she wasn't being embraced and adored. It was only after some self-reflection that the girl, who had suddenly found herself transformed after finishing her college entrance exams and traversing through time, realized she was now a fox. Caught in a whirlwind of emotions, the girl-turned-fox found herself being chased into the mansion's kitchen, where the tantalizing aroma of roast chicken greeted her. Unable to resist the temptation, she clumsily climbed onto the stove, unaware of the impending danger. Inside the kitchen, the female chef lamented the lack of clarity regarding Prince Chen's dietary preferences, fearing punishment if the food she prepared wasn't to his liking. Meanwhile, the fox reveled in the joy of indulging in a delicious meal, oblivious to the potential consequences. Half an hour later, the fox emerged from the kitchen, content but disoriented. As she savored the aftertaste of her impromptu feast, her senses tingled with the unmistakable scent of spiritual energy. Intrigued, she followed the scent and found herself face to face with a young man adorned in extravagant attire. Driven by an insatiable desire, the fox eagerly clung to the young man's thigh, reveling in the intoxicating essence of his spiritual energy. The prince, taken aback by the unexpected encounter, questioned the presence of such a fat cat in his mansion, only to be informed by his subordinates that it was, in fact, a fox. Confusion and curiosity mingled in the air as the prince contemplated the peculiar turn of events, while the fox continued to bask in the essence of the spiritual energy that surrounded her, unaware of the role she would soon play in the unfolding tale of Prince Chen's mansion. The prince's sudden revelation about the fox's true identity struck fear into the heart of the transformed girl. She knew all too well of the prince's reputation for mercilessness, and the prospect of facing his wrath sent her scrambling to escape. But before she could flee, the prince's swift hand caught hold of her, pinching the back of her neck. Startled and indignant, the fox protested vehemently, insisting that her lack of a neck was simply an illusion, and that she possessed a perfectly normal physique. However, her protests fell on deaf ears as the prince tossed her to his men to ascertain her origins. As the fox faced the grim reality of her situation, anger surged within her. Determined to defend herself, she launched a desperate attack on the prince, but her efforts were futile against his firm grip. The prince, unfazed by her outburst, remarked on the fox's spirited nature, speculating that she might be of the revered spirit fox lineage. Intrigued by this possibility, he decided to spare her life for the time being, ordering his men to clean her up before returning her. Relieved at the prospect of escaping with her life, the fox's gratitude mingled with a sense of disdain for the prince. However, the attendant's reassurance that surviving an encounter with the prince hinted at his interest in her offered a glimmer of hope amidst her misgivings. Despite her reservations, the fox couldn't help but acknowledge the potential benefits of aligning herself with someone of the prince's stature, especially considering her innate spiritual energy. The possibility of cultivating into a vixen under his patronage seemed tantalizing. Accompanied by Master Chingy's entourage, the fox was brought before a woman who seemed pleased at the sight of her. However, upon learning that the prince had ordered her to bathe the fox, her demeanor shifted drastically, and a palpable aura of hostility enveloped the room, leaving the fox bristling with unease. The little brother carried the adorable fox to the bathroom, intending to have the maid, Chingy, bathe her. However, the fox vehemently resisted, viewing Chingy as a threat and refusing to cooperate. Despite the fox's protests, the little brother attempted to hand her over to Chingy, but her struggles only intensified. Frustrated by the fox's resistance, the little brother sought an alternative approach. The fox, sensing his intentions, snuggled closer to him, sticking her tongue out defiantly at Chingy. Undeterred by the fox's attitude, Chingy remained determined to carry out her task. Just as Chingy was about to proceed, another woman, Ze, entered the scene. The little brother welcomed her warmly, surprised that the prince had sent her to care for the fox. This unexpected gesture hinted at the prince's fondness for the fox, elevating her status within the palace. Ze gently embraced the fox, who lay quietly in her arms. The little brother marveled at the fox's spiritual aura, realizing for the first time that Ze had never shown him such affection before. This newfound attention from Ze brought a sense of comfort to the fox. Late into the night, as the prince was engrossed in his studies, he inquired about the fox's well-being. The little brother assured him that Ze was taking good care of her, noting the prince's unusual concern. Curious about the fox's origins, the prince questioned the basis for labeling her as a spirit fox. The little brother explained the unique markings on the fox's tail, which aligned with ancient records of spirit foxes. Meanwhile, the fox basked in the comfort of Ze's care, relieved to have finally enjoyed a bath after her time-traveling ordeal. When Ze brought the fox to see the prince, the fox felt a twinge of fear, sensing the prince's imposing presence. The prince stood with crossed arms, scrutinizing the fox with a mix of annoyance and amusement. "Fat fox, why don't you come over here?" he challenged, his tone laced with authority. However, she remained defiant, refusing to yield to his authority. The prince, irritated by her arrogance, chastised her, but the fox, undeterred, continued to assert her independence. As the fox absorbed the rich spiritual energy in the prince's presence, she couldn't resist climbing onto his head, much to his displeasure. As expected, the aura above the prince's head was the clearest, signifying his potent spiritual energy. Her narrowed gaze betrayed his annoyance as he chastised the fox for daring to climb onto his head. The audacity of the fox to absorb spiritual energy, and he admonished, incredulous at her audacity. Just as the fox realized the danger of his position and prepared to flee, fate intervened as the prince seized him by the back of his neck. Thankfully, servants' timely arrival with food broke the tense moment, diverting attention from the fox's predicament. The sight of the chicken legs elicited a delighted response from the fox, momentarily distracting him from the prince's pointed remark about his earlier attempt to escape. Speechless and inwardly cursing the prince, the fox pushed him away fiercely, questioning if he was a mind reader. Awkwardly, Ze intervened, attributing the fox's behavior to his youth and hunger. Seizing the opportunity to emphasize his hunger, the fox playfully exaggerated, drawing attention to his exposed neck. Indulging in the chicken legs, the fox savored each bite, though the prince reminded him to maintain hygiene. Thoughtfully, the prince wiped the fox's mouth with his clothes, prompting an amused exchange of glances between the little brother and Ze. The light-hearted moment underscored the growing bond between the prince and the fox, prompting the prince to jest about the rhythm of raising a daughter. It seemed that their relationship was evolving, marked by a newfound closeness and understanding. As the prince resumed his work, the fox, satiated, curled up on the table, drifting into a peaceful slumber. Unbeknownst to her, the fox drifted into a dreamlike state and awoke to find herself back in modern times. Tears welled in her eyes as she reached out to her parents, only to realize that her touch passed through them. Shocked, she watched from above as her parents wept by her bedside, unaware of her ethereal presence. Confusion gripped her as she wondered why she cried even in her sleep, berating herself for her foolishness. As she regained consciousness, tears filled her eyes once more as she longed for her parents. The memory of the fierce prince and the fox's comical attempt at calling him daddy brought a bittersweet smile to her face. Determined to find a way home, she resolved to cultivate her abilities and adapt to her new form. However, her moment of introspection was interrupted by the prince's affectionate gestures, which she found irksome. "Can you please stop tickling my neck all the time?" she snapped, glaring at him with irritation. Just then, the prince's subordinates announced the arrival of General Ling Yuan. Seizing the opportunity to escape the prince's incessant teasing, the fox leaped towards him, demanding an end to his habit of pinching her neck. Ignoring her protests, the prince instructed Ze to attend to the fox's grooming, much to her dismay. As General Ling Yuan entered, the prince teased him about his supposed demise in battle, eliciting a playful retort. Curious about Ling Yuan's identity, the fox listened intently as Ze explained his close relationship with the prince, his loyalty, and his role as a defender on the border. Meanwhile, the fox struggled in Ze's grasp as she attempted to carry her through the door for a shower. The prince, engrossed in his writing, beckoned the fox to come closer. With a determined leap, the fox cleared the threshold, eliciting admiration from General Ling Yuan, who was captivated by her beauty. However, the prince quickly intervened, warning Ling Yuan against touching the fox, claiming sole ownership of her affection. As General Ling Yuan observed the scene with a somber expression, the prince diverted the fox's attention to a drawing he had made. The exaggerated depiction of the fox with soft pink fur and a plump physique elicited a mixture of amusement and self-consciousness from her. How could this be me, she wondered, taken aback by her portrayal. The prince, however, seemed pleased with his artwork, noting that it bore a striking resemblance to the fox. Intrigued by a discrepancy in the painting, he pointed to the ears, prompting the fox to investigate. To their surprise, hidden within the painted ears was a symbol representing the alien race of spirit foxes. Concerned by this revelation, the prince summoned Qingyi to examine the symbol closely. After a tense moment of scrutiny, Qingyi reluctantly acknowledged its significance, confirming the fox's suspicions. Relieved that her true identity remained concealed, the fox couldn't help but remark on the dangers she narrowly avoided, grateful for her lack of formal education that might have exposed her secret. Lost in her thoughts, the fox found herself fantasizing about the prince's military attaché, admiring his physique and imagining his hidden strength beneath his clothing. However, her reverie was abruptly interrupted by a reprimand from the prince, who accused her of being a perverted fox lost in her lustful thoughts. Undeterred by the prince's chastisement, the fox's attention was soon drawn to the aroma of dinner wafting through the air. Anticipation coursing through her, she eagerly approached the maids bearing trays of food, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the large chicken drumsticks. However, her excitement was short-lived as one of the maids accidentally stepped on her, prompting the prince to swiftly intervene, rescuing her from harm. Concerned for her well-being, he scolded the maid and ensured that the fox was unharmed. Despite the commotion, the fox remained preoccupied with her thoughts, absently touching her face with her paws. The fox couldn't help but ponder the implications of her transformed state, fearing that if she were to revert to human form, she might become a 300-pound woman, unrecognizable to her own parents. Her existential musings were interrupted by the prince, who presented her with chicken legs, her favorite indulgence. However, mindful of her recent desire to lose weight, she hesitated, prompting the prince to glare at her with a menacing gaze. Sensing his frustration, she quickly relented, realizing the consequences of defying his wishes. As she reluctantly partook in the meal, the prince, perhaps sensing her discomfort, ordered a maid to escort her for a bath. However, the fox's misfortune continued as she slipped on soap and tumbled into the water, struggling desperately due to her inability to swim. Overwhelmed by fear and panic, she lamented her lack of swimming skills, fearing for her life. In a moment of desperation, she longed to turn back time and reunite with her parents. Suddenly, the prince swooped in to rescue her, lifting her from the water. Grateful yet bewildered by his sudden act of kindness, as she tentatively reached out to touch her surroundings, she realized she wasn't touching a wall, but the prince's chest. Embarrassed by her vulnerability, the fox attempted to compose herself, only to be teased by the prince for her inability to swim. Her distress deepened as she noticed her nose bleeding, prompting the prince to suggest a bath to alleviate her discomfort. The fox, embarrassed by her nosebleed and the prince's teasing, attempted to avoid further embarrassment by declining a bath. However, the prince, undeterred by her protests, insisted on helping her, much to her chagrin. Despite her vigorous resistance, she found herself unable to escape his grasp as he clandestinely washed her back, causing her cheeks to flush with embarrassment. Confounded by the unfamiliar sensations coursing through her body, the fox struggled to comprehend her heightened emotions in the prince's presence. His casual touch only served to exacerbate her discomfort, prompting her to break free from his embrace. As she recoiled from the prince's touch, the fox found herself grappling with newfound feelings of arousal, a stark contrast to her usual demeanor. In an attempt to distract herself, the fox focused on learning to swim, much to the prince's surprise. His calm demeanor belied his astonishment at the fox's unexpected display of shyness, prompting him to reflect on the complexities of feminine nature. However, the fox's relief was short-lived as she broke free from his grasp once more, acutely aware of the growing tension between them. As Z took the fox out of the bath and dried its fur, the fox couldn't resist sticking out its tongue at the prince, relishing in the moment of defiance. Unimpressed by the prince's reaction, the fox was carried to his room by Z. Sensing the significance of the moment, Z remarked on the fox's luck in being allowed into the prince's inner sanctum for the first time. However, the fox's elation quickly turned to dismay as Z left, closing the door behind her. Alone in the prince's room, the fox felt a pang of unease, realizing that it had been confined against its will. Frantically pawing at the door, the fox pleaded to be let out, but there was no response from outside. Resigned to its fate, the fox reluctantly accepted the reality of its situation, feeling the weight of its innocence slipping away. Determined to escape, the fox resolved to find a way out of the room. The fox's eyes gleamed greedily as it spotted an emerald vase adorned with gems. In its mind, the value of the vase in modern times translated to a staggering one. 8 million, a fortune it could acquire if brought back to the present. However, as it reached out to grab the vase, its feet slipped, sending it tumbling to the ground. Just in the nick of time, the prince swooped in to catch the falling fox, albeit with a scolding for its penchant for troublemaking. Tearfully, the fox apologized to the prince, acknowledging its repeated need for rescue despite the prince's intimidating demeanor. The prince offered the fox a place to sleep, inviting it to share his bed. Despite the fox's initial resistance, it found solace in the warmth of the prince's embrace as they drifted off to sleep. In the morning light, the fox awoke feeling refreshed, only to be confronted by a disapproving maid who discovered it nestled beside the prince. Shocked and indignant, the maid berated the fox for daring to soil the prince's bed with its presence. Unable to defend itself verbally, the fox could only tremble in fear as the maid accused it of audacious behavior. However, in a moment of desperation, the fox pushed the maid away, prompting her to fall to the ground in a fit of dramatics. Taking charge of the situation, the prince chastised the maid for her overreaction, defending the fox's innocence. As the maid knelt before him, begging for forgiveness. Upon the maid's accusation, the prince reprimanded her for her negligence, blaming her for allowing the fox into his bed. He then instructed her to leave and face the consequences of her actions, forbidding her from entering his room again until she rectified her mistake. As Xiaotsui hurriedly exited the room, her vengeful glare betrayed her true intentions. She vowed to seek revenge on the fox for her humiliation, her resentment simmering beneath the surface. Meanwhile, the fox remained asleep, undisturbed by the commotion, until the prince roused her with a gentle touch. Irritated by the delay in her meal, the fox initially dismissed the prince's attempts to wake her, feigning disinterest until her hunger got the better of her. Finally awake, the fox begrudgingly agreed to accompany the prince for a meal. However, before they could leave, Z arrived with news that the Lord Shangshu was waiting for an audience in the study. The prince, feeling a twinge of irritation, instructed Z to take care of the fox while he went to dine. Meanwhile, the fox, ever curious, inspected the governor's mouth, musing over the prince's demanding schedule even during meal times. Z gently stroked the fox's head, reminding it to behave well and appreciate the prince's efforts. Agreeing half-heartedly, the fox nodded in compliance. Under Z's attentive care, the fox soon found itself contentedly full. Eager to stretch its legs, the fox ventured into the garden for a leisurely stroll, barking twice to signal its desire to play. As it wandered among the various flower beds, the fox couldn't resist the allure of the vibrant blooms. Picking out the most exquisite flowers, it decided to gather a bouquet to present to the prince. However, amidst the colorful array of flowers, the fox's attention was suddenly captured by a solitary red bloom standing tall among the rest. Intrigued, it approached the flower, only to watch in awe as it transformed into a striking black blossom. Intrigued by the flower's uncanny resemblance to the prince's stern demeanor, the fox couldn't help but wonder if the prince would appreciate such a unique gift. With a mischievous glint in its eye, the fox decided to pluck the black flower, thinking it might just be the perfect offering for the prince. Suddenly, the prince sneezed, prompting him to wonder who was speaking ill of him. The fox, delighted by the discovery of a pink flower, decided to gift it to Z as a token of appreciation. However, as it continued its stroll, a tantalizing aroma wafted through the air, tempting its senses. Driven by hunger, the fox followed the scent to a nearby pavilion where a plate of osmanthus cake lay unattended. With no one in sight, the fox succumbed to temptation and swiftly snatched a cake, savoring its sweetness. Just as it finished indulging, 3 maids approached the pavilion, led by none other than the notorious Xiaotsui, intending to present the cakes to the prince. Upon noticing a missing cake, Xiaotsui immediately suspected foul play. Under the table, the guilty fox cowered, trembling in fear, as the fox attempted to use her weak spiritual power to render herself invisible and escape. Her plans were thwarted by her own size. With a heavy thud, she stumbled off the stone bench, unable to contain her cry of pain. Instantly, the maids noticed the commotion, realizing that the invisible thief who had stolen the cakes was none other than the fox. Panicked, the fox attempted to flee, but her escape was cut short when Xiaotsui, the black-hearted maid, seized her by the back of the neck. With a sneer, Xiaotsui identified the fox as the culprit and berated her for her thievery. The fox found herself surrounded by 2 maids, each with their own intentions. The maid on the right harbored cruel thoughts, believing the fox deserved death, while the one on the left worried about being discovered. Xiaotsui identified the fox as the culprit and berated her for her thievery. Expressing disbelief that the prince could harbor affection for such a creature, she felt the discomfort of Xiaotsui's grip around her neck, tears welling in her eyes from the pain and frustration of her predicament. As the situation grew dire, the fox silently pleaded for Ze to come to her rescue. Meanwhile, Xiaotsui, seizing the opportunity, sought to sway the other maids to her side, blaming the fox for the trouble she had caused. Recalling the events earlier, Xiaotsui accused the fox of being the instigator, urging the other maids to support her plan to dispose of the fox. With cruel intent, she proposed killing the fox and disposing of her in a well, showing no remorse for her actions. Shaken by the maid's callousness, the fox cried out for help with all her strength. Just then, Ze, alerted by the fox's distress, rushed to the scene, her voice taking on a commanding tone as she demanded an explanation. Seeing Ze's arrival, Xiaotsui attempted to silence the fox, threatening her with violence if she made any more noise. However, Ze intervened, ordering the maids to stand down and addressing the situation with concern. Xiaotsui, attempting to justify her actions, claimed that she merely wanted to touch the fox because she found her cute. However, the fox's refusal to be touched and her cries of distress contradicted Xiaotsui's claims, exposing her true intentions. Despite the language barrier preventing the fox from articulating her side of the story, Ze admonished the maids for their mistreatment of the fox, warning them against further harm. Despite being a regent, Prince Chen did not tolerate cruelty, even from his servants. Ze escorted the fox back to her room, allowing her to rest. However, before the fox could fully relax, she presented Ze with a pink flower, a gesture of gratitude for her timely intervention. Ze, touched by the unexpected gift, accepted it with surprise and appreciation. The fox nodded gratefully as Ze smelled the flower, her heart warmed by the gesture. However, as Ze exited the room, the fox's expression turned serious. She vowed silently to seek revenge against Xiaotsui, the maid who had threatened her life. With determination in her heart, the fox slept deeply until the moon hung high in the sky. When the prince returned to the room, he found her asleep, her exhaustion evident from missing dinner. Concerned, he reached out to wake her, only to be met with a cry of pain. Alarmed, the prince inspected the fox, discovering scars hidden beneath her fur. Enraged, he vowed to find the culprit responsible for harming his beloved pet. Determined to handle the situation himself, the prince called for Qing Yi to summon the imperial doctor. He instructed the doctor to treat the fox's injuries and investigate the events of the day. Fuming with anger, the prince warned that those who dared to harm his pet would face severe consequences. Soon, Dr. Li arrived and applied baijiao ointment to the fox's wounds, reassuring the prince that she would recover in 3 days. However, the prince, skeptical of the remedy's effectiveness, demanded assurances from Dr. Li, who trembled in fear before hastily departing. As the doctor fled, the prince remained resolute in his determination to protect his pet. The prince, though not a veterinarian, diligently applied ointment to the fox's injured skin, eliciting cries of pain from the creature. Despite the discomfort, the fox endured, finding solace in the prince's gentle strokes, particularly on her tail. The intimate gesture caused her cheeks to flush, and she lay quietly on the bed, finding some measure of comfort in the prince's care. As the prince continued to tend to her wounds, he reassured the fox of his protective stance, urging her to inform him if anyone dared to harm her again. However, the fox, determined to seek revenge herself, shook her head defiantly, unwilling to rely solely on others for justice. Though taken aback by her refusal, the prince respected her resolve, recognizing her independence and strength of character. He held her close as she drifted off to sleep, silently pondering her next move. Later that night, servant arrived to report on the fox's condition. Learning the truth about the fox's injuries, the prince contemplated whether to punish those responsible. However, he ultimately decided to keep a close watch on the fox, determined to prevent any further harm. Confused by the fox's refusal to accept his help, the prince resolved to let her play her own game for now, trusting that she would take action when the time was right. Meanwhile, in the solitude of her room, the fox grappled with her own sense of helplessness, channeling her frustrations into diligent spiritual practice. Determined to overcome her adversaries and reclaim her agency, she immersed herself in her training. In the evening, Xiaocui stealthily approached the kitchen door of Prince Chen's house, hoping to find some food. However, to her dismay, she discovered that the kitchen was empty, with no sign of any meal prepared. Frustrated, she cursed the absent cook for leaving nothing to eat. As she grumbled to herself, a loud clang echoed through the kitchen as the spoon rack fell to the ground. Startled, Xiaocui whirled around, demanding to know who was there, warning them not to play tricks. Suddenly, a stone hurled from above struck Xiaocui on the head, sending her into a panic. Tears welled in her eyes as she cried out in fear, uncertain whether her assailant was human or ghostly. Meanwhile, the fox, having spent the day honing her skills in preparation for revenge, seized the opportunity to strike. Observing Xiaocui's distress, she unleashed her accumulated lingli, aiming to teach her tormentor a lesson. Xiaocui, bewildered and enraged, shouted threats at her unseen attacker, only to be met with a barrage of more stones. Desperate to escape, she dodged the projectiles, feeling a sense of unease creep over her as the kitchen seemed to take on a sinister aura. Just as she made a dash for the door, two other maids entered the kitchen, asking what had happened. Before Xiaocui could respond, the door slammed shut on its own, trapping them inside. In the eerie silence that followed, fear gripped the trio, their trembling voices betraying their unease at the ominous turn of events. Xiaocui's frantic cries for help echoed through the kitchen as she pounded on the door, proclaiming the presence of a ghost. Meanwhile, the fox, perched invisibly on the beam above, watched as her adversaries entered the room. With a smug grin, she wielded the stones in her paws, reveling in the opportunity for retribution. To the fox's surprise, the three maids cowered on the ground, shielding themselves with pot lids as if sensing the danger looming above. Amused by their futile efforts, the fox couldn't help but scoff at their antics. Disappointed by their lack of resolve, the fox decided to take matters into her own hands. With a simple command, she compelled Xiaocui to slap herself, setting off a chain reaction as the other maids followed suit, their faces reddening with each resounding smack. As the maids unwittingly inflicted punishment upon themselves, the fox couldn't contain her amusement, relishing in her newfound ability to control others with her thoughts. Suddenly, Shili's desperate cries pierced the air, pleading for help from within the kitchen. With a sense of satisfaction, the fox realized that her revenge had been achieved. Though Xiaocui suspected the fox's involvement in the strange occurrences, the fox remained indifferent to her suspicions. Having mastered cultivation, the fox returned to her room, a black flower clutched delicately in her mouth. With a mischievous glint in her eyes, she presented the flower to the prince, declaring it a special gift chosen just for him. The prince, taken aback by the unexpected gesture, jokingly questioned whether the black flower symbolized his reputedly black-hearted nature. The fox shook her head, indicating that she didn't mean any offense. The prince, amused by her silly and cute demeanor, teased her about not knowing the type of flower she had brought him. "I won't argue with you," he chuckled, recognizing her sincerity in offering the gift. Speechless at the prince's playful banter, the fox remained determined to convey her genuine intentions through the gift. Yet, the prince's continued teasing prompted her to humorously remark. The prince affectionately pinched the fox's chubby cheeks, playfully accusing her of harboring negative thoughts about him. The fox, with a fierce expression, protested his accusation, but the prince's jest continued as he questioned whether she could truly read minds. Flicking her ears lightly, the prince marveled at the fox's ability to convey various emotions, expressing his curiosity about her intelligence and whether she was truly just a fox. Sensing his scrutiny, the fox quickly adopted a poker face, concealing her thoughts from the prince's probing gaze. With tears welling in her eyes, the fox contemplated her options, realizing escape was her best chance at survival. Igniting her latent potential, she leaped outside in a desperate bid for freedom, but her efforts were in vain as the prince swiftly caught her by the neck. Pleading for her life, the fox begged the prince not to kill her, her heart racing with fear. To her surprise, the prince gently placed her on his shoulder, his eyes filled with curiosity and understanding. In that moment, the fox acknowledged her mistake, recognizing the prince's kindness and acceptance despite her fears. As the prince cradled her in his arms, he reassured her that she was now under his protection, regardless of her true nature. Touched by the prince's compassion, the fox vowed never to flee again, accepting her role as his cherished pet. The prince, noticing a change in the fox's ear pattern, became intrigued, pondering whether it indicated the purification of the spirit power by the chubby fox. Despite the prince's curiosity, the fox, in his typical arrogant manner, brushed off any inquiries about his condition, determined to pursue his own path to becoming a spirit. Before anyone could react, the fox dashed off towards a nearby stone mountain, drawn by the potent spiritual energy emanating from the area. Ignoring Z's calls to stop, the fox pressed onward, eager to explore the source of the energy. Upon reaching the mountain, the fox was overwhelmed by the intensity of the spiritual power. The fox, overwhelmed by the potent spiritual energy, felt dizzy and collapsed to the ground, losing consciousness. Upon awakening the next morning, she found herself in a state of confusion, marveling at the comfort of her surroundings and the noticeable improvement in her spiritual power. Realizing Ze was nowhere to be found, however, Ze was currently kneeling before the prince, likely explaining the fox's sudden disappearance. Feeling a pang of guilt for causing Ze worry, the fox resolved to find her as soon as possible. However, she couldn't shake the feeling of excitement over her newfound spiritual power and the possibility that Ze had led her to a feng shui treasure. Meanwhile, Ze, feeling distressed over the fox's disappearance, pleaded with the prince for more time. Lying on the ground in a desperate attempt to gain his understanding and patience, Xingyi joined Ze in kneeling before the prince, pleading for another chance to locate the missing fox. Ze, feeling remorseful for her mistake, begged for forgiveness. The prince took responsibility for all mistakes and even considered severe punishment, including beheading his closest subordinates, as an act of mercy. However, just as the situation seemed dire, the little fox returned at a critical moment, bringing relief to all involved. In a burst of anger, the fox confronted the prince, insisting that the blame was entirely hers and defending Sister Ze. The prince, however, asserted his dominance by gripping the fox's neck, warning her against any attempts to escape. The fox, seething with anger, maintained her stance, refusing to flee. At this tense moment, Xingyi intervened with a smile, suggesting that Ze's punishment could be spared now that the fox had returned. Trembling with fear, Ze awaited her fate as the fox lay on the prince's shoulder, contemplating the situation. Realizing the prince's affection for her, the fox softened her demeanor, feigning innocence and pleading for Ze's release. Blushing at her display, the prince dismissed Ze and Xingyi, much to their relief. Alone with the fox, the prince grew serious, questioning her whereabouts. The fox, with a click, indicated that she had been to the back mountain. The fox clicked, acknowledging the prince's observation about the darkening lines on her ears. Curious, the prince extended his hand, emitting a light cyan glow, and began transferring spiritual power to the fox. Confused by the prince's actions, the fox questioned why he was imparting spiritual power to her. However, the prince remained silent, intrigued by the potential consequences of strengthening the fox's spirit. Undeterred, the prince continued to transmit spiritual energy to the fox, ignoring her puzzled expression. As he concentrated on the task, the fox couldn't help but mock him, questioning his intelligence. Amused by the fox's sass, the prince playfully threatened her, joking about the possibility of reading her thoughts. To the fox's surprise, the prince revealed his ability to communicate with her using a divine stone, sparking excitement in the fox's eyes. Thrilled by the prospect of conversing through the divine stone, the fox expressed relief at no longer having to talk to herself. However, her joy was interrupted when the prince playfully pinched her chubby cheeks, reminding her of his authority. Pondering the prince's trust in her intelligence, the fox couldn't help but wonder if he was concerned that she might be a monster. In an attempt to reassure the fox, the prince affectionately stroked her fur, dismissing any notion of her being a threat due to her limited spiritual power. Yet, the fox couldn't help but feel a pang of embarrassment at her current state of vulnerability. Yearning for empowerment, the fox sought solace in the presence of Z, visiting her room under the veil of night. With sorrow evident in her eyes, she humbly apologized to Z, acknowledging the trouble she had inadvertently caused earlier in the day. Z gently touched the fox's head, offering reassurance and understanding despite the day's events. The fox, overcome with emotion, expressed genuine remorse for the trouble caused. Z, with a warm smile, absolved the fox of any blame, acknowledging her own shortcomings in caring for her. Tears welled up in the fox's eyes as the gravity of the situation sank in. Despite Z's comforting words, the fox couldn't shake off the fear of the danger she had narrowly escaped. Taking the fox into his arms, Z reaffirmed her commitment to protecting her charge, emphasizing the importance and honor she felt in fulfilling her duty. The bond between them grew stronger as they shared this mutual understanding and trust. That night, as exhaustion finally overcame her, the fox drifted into a deep slumber. Stirring from her sleep, she felt a hand lifting her up. Instinctively, she protested. The prince, unmoved by the fox's plea, confronted her about sleeping in so late. Caught off guard, the fox found herself speechless, realizing she had overslept. The prince carried the fox and walked outside and gently explained to the fox the importance of behaving well as they were about to enter the palace, where many dignitaries would be present. The fox, curious but still a bit puzzled, followed the prince's lead as they approached the grand entrance. Upon arriving, they were greeted by the opulent sight of a luxury sedan waiting for them. The fox's eyes widened in awe at the grandeur of the palace and the gathering of distinguished guests. The prince chuckled at the fox's eagerness to eat, indulging her request by feeding her another piece of meat. The exquisite flavor of the black goose delighted the fox's palate, and she couldn't help but express her satisfaction. Observing from afar, the star girl's curiosity was piqued by the sight of Prince Chen with a pet, a rarity given his supposed misophobia. She wondered about the significance of this peculiar relationship and whether it hinted at a change in the prince's demeanor. As the banquet continued, the prince's attention remained focused on the fox, ensuring her comfort and enjoyment. In the midst of the festivities, the fox's innocent delight over the delicious food captivated Prince, prompting suggestions to bring the palace chef to prepare more delicacies for her pleasure. The prince, amused by the fox's charm, entertained the idea, considering it a small price to pay for her happiness. However, his tranquility was interrupted by the sudden appearance of the blue-haired girl, startling the fox. Feeling unsettled by the girl's presence, the fox sought reassurance from the prince, gently patting his shoulder. Yet, Prince remained focused on her meal, ignoring the girl's attempts to engage him in conversation. As the girl persisted in offering him a drink, the fox observed the prince's response with a mixture of confusion and amusement. Seeing the prince's continued disregard, the blue-haired girl eventually retreated in disappointment, unable to elicit a response from him. Meanwhile, onlookers in the distance speculated on the situation, attributing the prince's behavior to the fox's influence. Despite the commotion, the prince remained unperturbed, his attention solely on the fox. As the little fox indulged in the delicious palace feast, unaware of the brewing danger, it was the first time since its time travel that it had dined in such luxury. The sight of the lavish spread filled the fox with greed, and it couldn't help but drool at the sight. Satisfied with its meal, the little fox patted its belly contentedly, reveling in the comfort of the feast it had enjoyed. Feeling a bit uncomfortable after indulging in the feast, the little fox frowned and excused itself to go to the restroom. Meanwhile, the prince was engrossed in conversation with the emperor, oblivious to the fox's departure. Sensing an urgent need to relieve itself, the little fox hurriedly dashed outside in search of the restroom, mindful of its inability to urinate just anywhere in its current fox form. Unbeknownst to the fox, its every move was being closely observed by the two blue-haired girls, who watched with sneers playing at the corners of their mouths. As the fox leisurely emerged from the restroom, feeling relieved, it suddenly felt a hand grab its neck from behind. Startled, the fox demanded to know the identity of its assailant, only to find itself face to face with the two blue-haired girls. Despite the threatening situation, the little fox couldn't help but maintain a hint of its usual cuteness, quipping about being found and jokingly asking if the prince had sent them to fetch it. With a mischievous grin, the little fox stretched out its paws as if to hug the blue-haired girl. However, before it could make a move, the girl grabbed the fox's cheek and accused it of using some kind of magic to gain favor with King Chen. Undeterred, the fox retorted, attributing its charm to its own beauty and questioning why the prince couldn't resist it. Feeling proud of its wit, the little fox provocatively touched its cheek, further enraging the two girls. They exchanged glances filled with animosity and suggested eliminating all traces of the fox while the prince was away. Suddenly feeling the gravity of the situation, the fox attempted to deny being a vixen, but its words were cut short as the blue-haired girl tightened her grip around its neck. The little fox's face contorted in pain as the blue-haired girl threatened to harm it further. Sensing the danger, it summoned its innate power, emitting a bright blue light from its claws. The maid, recognizing the potential danger, warned the blue-haired girl to be cautious around the fox, but before she could finish, the fox struck, leaving a bloody scratch on the girl's cheek. Enraged by the attack, the blue-haired girl lunged toward the fox, seeking vengeance for the injury. Feeling embarrassed and frustrated by its inability to effectively use its spiritual power, the fox watched anxiously as the blue-haired woman approached, her anger palpable. "Smelly fox, you are dead today," she threatened, advancing menacingly. In desperation, the fox cried out for the prince's assistance, hoping that he would come to its rescue and prevent further harm. As the prince arrived, the blue-haired girl was suddenly taken aback by his presence. She was visibly shaken as he held the little fox protectively in his arms, his gaze cold and unwavering. The blue-haired girl, feeling a tinge of guilt, nervously addressed the prince, "Your Highness, why are you here?" However, the prince remained silent, his actions speaking louder than words as he summoned Qingyi from the shadows to deal with the situation. Without further acknowledgement of the girl's inquiry, the prince instructed Qingyi to take both her and her companion to the bottom of the lake as punishment, to become food for the fish dwelling there. Qingyi nodded solemnly, acknowledging the prince's command. Despite the blue-haired girl's loud protests, claiming innocence, the prince's steely gaze silenced her. With just one look, he made it clear that daring to lay a hand on his pet was reason enough for her fate. Returning home, the little fox weakly pleaded with the prince not to execute the blue-haired girl. The prince, puzzled by the fox's request to spare someone who had sought to harm him, listened as the fox explained that killing within the palace was morally wrong. Surprised by the fox's moral reasoning, the prince nodded, indebted to the fox for sparing him a troublesome situation. He agreed to spare the blue-haired girl as the fox had requested. The little fox fell asleep, murmuring about the delicious chicken drumsticks. Meanwhile, the prince, seated in his study, inquired about the situation from Qingyi. Qingyi reported that he had locked the two women in the backyard of the palace, awaiting the prince's decision. The prince, indifferent, remarked that it didn't matter if the two women were of no use. This response puzzled Qingyi, who recalled the prince's earlier intention to kill the women. However, the prince explained that he had promised the little fox not to kill them but to ensure they lived a life worse than death. As part of their punishment, their tongues would be cut out to prevent them from uttering the word vixen ever again. Qingyi accepted the order, acknowledging the unfortunate fate of the two women, who had caused the little fox to lose her appetite. Meanwhile, the prince couldn't help but feel speechless as he observed the little fox dreaming of countless chicken legs, a testament to her insatiable appetite. He couldn't help but wonder if she thought about food day and night. The prince, contemplating food all day long, turned the little fox over to inspect her wound. Startled, the little fox cried out in pain, reminding the prince of her vulnerability. He scolded her sternly, cautioning her not to run around recklessly in the future. Fortunately, he still had some baicha ointment left from their previous use. He applied a bit to the wound, eliciting a comfortable sigh from the little fox. Observing this tender moment, one would never have imagined that the prince possessed such a gentle side. The following morning, amidst the incessant chirping of birds, the little fox awoke, surprised to find herself still in the prince's presence. To her amazement, the wound no longer hurt. She attributed the speedy recovery to her recent exercise regimen, which had undoubtedly improved her physique. As the little fox contemplated her improved condition, the two-headed chicken proudly declared its presence. Just then, Zi entered the room, prompting the little fox to leap from the bed, ready to face the day ahead. Zi advised the little fox about the dangers of jealousy among women, urging her not to stray from the prince's side when out and about. Understanding the implications, the little fox reassured Z by indicating she would steer clear of such situations in the future. With an innocent and hungry expression, the little fox caught Z off guard. Despite having just returned from the palace banquet, the little fox's appetite seemed insatiable. Taking her to the kitchen in search of something delicious, Z was surprised to find a bowl of steaming seafood porridge still waiting. Excitedly, Z offered to feed the little fox, cautioning her not to make a mess and promising to find a spoon. After cooling the porridge, Z approached the little fox with the spoon, who seemed a bit panicked by the sight of the delicious meal before her. The little fox's tail bristled, and she recoiled in alarm. Z, unsure whether the fox disliked the taste or sensed something wrong, rationalized that even if the food wasn't appetizing, it was better than going hungry. To her surprise, the little fox swiftly swiped the bowl off the table with her paw. Concerned, Z inquired about the fox's behavior. With a sense of urgency, the little fox pointed to the spilled porridge. Z, feeling uneasy, cautiously inspected the scattered food, noting a strange blue gas emanating from it. Hastily retrieving a silver needle from her sleeve, she tested the porridge for poison, discovering that it indeed contained a lethal substance. Relieved that the fox had detected the danger, Z praised her intelligence and promptly went to seek Chingy's assistance in dealing with the poisoned porridge. Meanwhile, outside the door, the commotion had attracted a group of ants, unaware of the danger posed by the toxic food. Just then, footsteps approached the door, catching the little fox's attention, prompting her to listen intently. The little fox wondered if Z had returned so soon, but to her surprise, a stranger barged in, accusing her of causing him harm. Confused, the fox questioned where she had offended him. Suddenly, it dawned on her, could he be responsible for poisoning the seafood porridge? Unable to understand the fox's language, the man charged at her with hostility, intent on harming her. Feeling frightened and helpless, the little fox dodged the man's advances, wondering why people always seemed to target her neck. This time, however, she was prepared. Stepping back, she inadvertently struck the iron pot frame with her head, causing it to collide with the man's head. The impact left the fox with a swollen head, but it momentarily stunned the intruder. As the man recovered, he reached out to grab the fox, expressing his frustration at her interfering with his plans. Incensed, the little fox retorted defiantly, refusing to accept being insulted as fat and stupid. The little fox, still shaken from the encounter, used her spiritual power to knock the man to the ground before rushing out of the room. Z, along with Ching-yi, responded to the fox's distress call and entered the chaotic kitchen, where the man had disappeared. Although the poisoner had fled, he asked the little fox if she had seen the culprit's face. Despite the fox's affirmative response, Z and Ching-yi were at a loss, realizing that only the fox had witnessed the perpetrator's identity. The little fox, undeterred by their mockery, raised her face with her paws and began sketching strokes in the air, gesturing to illustrate the culprit's appearance. She mimicked his mouth shape and other features, urging Z and Ching-yi to pay attention. Amused but also impressed by the fox's intelligence, Z and Ching-yi followed her instructions and accompanied her to the study, where they provided her with paper and a brush. Despite their initial skepticism, they watched in astonishment as the fox diligently painted with the brush, which seemed comically large in her tiny paws. After half an hour of concentrated effort, the little fox wiped her sweat and proudly presented her finished painting to Z and Ching-yi. Their initial amusement turned to shock and laughter as they beheld the crude depiction of the culprit. They couldn't contain their amusement at the comical depiction. However, the little fox, undeterred by their laughter, defended his work, insisting that the painting captured the culprit's likeness accurately. Despite their amusement, the men acknowledged the fox's efforts and the potential value of his artistic rendering in identifying the suspect. The little fox, sensing the prince's return, quickly composed herself and presented the drawing of the assassin to him. The prince, intrigued by the fox's artistic endeavor, examined the portrait with interest. Despite his efforts to maintain a serious demeanor, he couldn't help but chuckle at the fox's interpretation, remarking on the unusual appearance of the suspect. The little fox, eager to clarify, explained that while she had indeed drawn the portrait, her artistic skills were rudimentary, relying solely on her claws. She emphasized that her depiction was based on her observations, rather than any formal training in art. The prince held the little fox close and requested further details about the man's appearance. With determination, the little fox continued to describe the man's distinctive features, emphasizing his triangular eyes, pronounced nose, thick lips, and overall unattractive appearance, suggesting that he was not familiar to their household. Despite the comical nature of the drawing, the prince recognized the urgency of the situation and promptly ordered Chingy to seal off the entire palace in search of the culprit described by the little fox. Meanwhile, as the investigation commenced, the little fox lay in the prince's arms, her stomach growling loudly. Frustrated by her persistent hunger, she vented her annoyance to the prince, who looked on with amusement at her antics. As the prince and the little fox made their way to the kitchen, they were suddenly confronted by a sharp knife aimed at the prince's face. The prince's reflexes kicked in, and he swiftly moved to evade the attack, narrowly avoiding the blade. Reacting quickly, the prince pushed the little fox behind him, shielding her from any potential harm. With a stern expression, he assessed the situation, ready to defend himself and the little fox against any further threats. The little fox, startled by the sudden attack, gripped onto the prince's robes tightly, her heart racing with fear. She remained close to the prince, seeking safety and protection in his presence. As the assassin lunged forward with his dagger, the prince swiftly dodged the attack, evading the blade with ease. The little fox, perched on the prince's shoulder, exclaimed in excitement, recognizing the assailant as the same man from the kitchen earlier. The prince remained composed, acknowledging the resemblance between the assassin and the little fox's drawing. With the little fox on his shoulder, the prince made a decisive move, leaping into action to confront the assassin head-on. With calculated precision, he deftly maneuvered around the assassin's strikes, testing his opponent's martial prowess. Observing the assassin's clumsy movements, the prince taunted him, highlighting the inadequacy of his combat skills. In a swift and decisive motion, the prince delivered a powerful blow to the assassin's chin, incapacitating him instantly. The defeated assassin stared up at the prince in disbelief, astonished by the prince's formidable martial arts prowess. Despite his fear, he couldn't deny the sheer power and skill displayed by King Chen in combat. As the guards escorted the defeated assassin away, Fox couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity for the man with such a distinctive face. The prince, unfazed by the assassin's pleas for mercy, ordered his punishment before proceeding to the hall to address the matter further. Watching the guards drag the assassin away, the little fox couldn't contain her curiosity. She asked the prince if there were many people who wished him harm. The prince, with a solemn nod, acknowledged the constant threat to his position. Feeling a sense of sadness, the little fox realized the precarious nature of the prince's position, despite his noble status. She understood that the prince's life was always at risk, even with his esteemed position. The prince, in turn, felt a sense of reassurance knowing that the little fox was always by his side. However, he couldn't shake off the worry of what might happen if the little fox wasn't there to protect him one day. As morning arrived once again, as the little fox opened her eyes dimly, the sight of the prince's naked body with his impressive 8-pack abs caused the fur on her back to stand up in surprise. Shyly holding onto the quilt, the prince questioned the fox's intentions, to which the fox, feeling unjustly accused, protested, stating she was just a simple fox. The prince, however, rebuked her, claiming it was the fox who had seduced him with her nudity. Saddened by the accusation, the little fox pondered the prince's command to start practicing early every day, realizing the gravity of her laziness and low spiritual power. Fearing for her safety in the prince's absence, the fox resolved to change her ways and eagerly jumped onto the prince's head, ready to begin practicing. The prince carried the little fox to the back mountain, where the spiritual energy was abundant. The fox, still in the midst of a deep sleep, had a bit of saliva at the corner of her mouth. Gently, the prince leaned in close to the fox's ear and teased about eating chicken drumsticks. Waking up to the mention of food, the little fox's eyes lit up with excitement. She pleaded eagerly for a taste of the delicious treat. However, the prince's expression turned serious as he warned the fox about her habit of sleeping in. He threatened consequences if the habit persisted. Realizing her fault, the little fox sheepishly apologized, acknowledging that she tended to doze off every time they came to the back mountain. The prince agreed to let the fox rest but insisted on diligent practice. He promised to assign someone to supervise the fox's training. Feeling a bit downhearted, the little fox understood the prince's concerns and resolved to do better. With renewed determination, she embarked on her training, grateful for the prince's guidance and support. After practicing alone all afternoon, the little fox was greeted by the prince, who asked about her progress. Excitedly, the fox declared that her spiritual power felt almost full after the dedicated practice session. Pleased with the fox's efforts, the prince promised a delicious reward. Eagerly anticipating the treat, the little fox eagerly awaited the promised delicacy. However, to her dismay, the prince presented a meal that made the fox gag. Feeling betrayed, the little fox couldn't hold back her disgust and vomited out the meal from the previous night. The prince, frustrated by the fox's reaction, vented his anger on the table and stormed out of the room. Confused by the prince's sudden anger, the little fox turned to Z for an explanation. Z awkwardly revealed that the dish was prepared by the prince himself, leaving the little fox surprised by the revelation. Feeling remorseful for the prince's failed cooking attempt, the little fox was overcome with guilt, realizing that she may have hurt Dehalian's feelings. Z explained that it was the prince's first time cooking and that he had spent the whole afternoon preparing the dish, emphasizing the prince's kindness towards the fox. Tears welled up in the little fox's eyes as she realized the extent of her mistake in rejecting the prince's efforts. Determined to make amends, the fox decided to apologize to the prince. However, when she approached the prince, the fox found him sitting alone in the study, engrossed in a book. Summoning up her courage, the little fox entered the study and approached the prince, expressing her regret and seeking forgiveness. Climbing onto the table, the fox gently nudged the prince and pleaded with him not to be angry. The little fox, eager to make amends, proposed to cook a meal for the prince as a way to compensate for her earlier behavior. The prince, initially hesitant, eventually agreed, giving the fox a chance to redeem herself. Encouraged by the prince's response, the little fox was determined to prepare a delicious meal to express her gratitude. The little fox, determined to prove herself, rushed into the kitchen and started cooking. Meanwhile, the prince stood outside, watching with concern, while Chang'e expressed doubts about the little fox's culinary skills. Despite the challenges of cooking in her animal form, the little fox managed to prepare a meal within half an hour. After finishing, she wiped the sweat off her face and admired the plate of delicate eggs she had cooked, hoping it would impress the prince. The little fox proudly presented the egg-fried rice, which was perfectly cooked with crystal-clear grains and a delightful color and fragrance. The prince, intrigued by the aroma, entered the kitchen and reassured the little fox that he wouldn't ridicule her efforts. As the little fox tasted the dish, she declared it to be a delicacy from her hometown, egg-fried rice. The prince, although skeptical at first, decided to give it a try. With anticipation, the little fox awaited his verdict. Carefully chewing the dish, the prince's expression remained stoic. Surprisingly, the simple blend of eggs and rice turned out to be surprisingly delicious, eliciting a positive comment from his otherwise impassive mouth. Disheartened by the lukewarm response, the little fox couldn't help but recall fond memories of her mother's cooking, which had always been delightful. She couldn't shake off the disappointment, feeling a pang of longing for the delicious meals her mother used to prepare. As the little fox expressed her longing for her mother's cooking, tears welled up in her eyes, but she struggled to articulate her feelings. Sensing the fox's distress, the prince embraced her tightly, offering words of comfort and reassurance. Despite knowing the likelihood that the little fox's parents were no longer alive, the prince sought to alleviate her sadness, promising that the palace would be her new home. Reflecting on the significance of the moment, the little fox felt a mix of emotions, grateful for the prince's kindness yet saddened by the absence of her family. With a heavy heart, she acknowledged that the egg-fried rice, a simple dish from her homeland, failed to impress the prince, who spoke kindly despite his lack of enjoyment.